Grin, you and I will need to go to Aldi first thing in the morning because that's us running out of toilet paper and we're going to end up having to use our hand. Oh, hello! And welcome to Measle and the Wrathmonk Chapter 2 by Ian Ogilvy and illustrated by Chris Mould and printed by Oxford University Press. Tonight we're going to be reading Chapter 2. Now if you remember in Chapter 1, Measle had managed to get his evil legal guardian out of the house so that he could play with Basil's train set. And he managed to come up with a plan to get him out of the house, so let's see how he goes with that. Chapter 2. The train set. Measle's brilliant idea was this. Once he'd got Basil Drabblebone out of the house, he would climb up the stairs to the attic and push open the door and sit down on Basil Tramplebone's special high stool and reach over and turn the master knob, the one that brought the train set to life. And then, well, he'd just sit there and play with the biggest and probably best train set in the entire world for an hour or so. Of course, Measle's idea wasn't really all that brilliant. Basil Tramplebone would get to the bank and find out that there wasn't any extra money at all, and then he'd find out about the telephone, and that would make him completely furious. And when Basil Tramplebone was completely furious, Measle's life became even nastier than before. But Measle didn't think of this, because he was so excited by the rest of the plan. The idea of playing with Basil's train set without any interference was just too good to pass up. Something else that was too good to pass up was the opportunity to eat something. Measle went quickly to the kitchen, and it smelled even worse than usual today, and opened the ancient refrigerator. He was hoping to find something nice in there, but there was nothing at all, except a paper bag full of old, wrinkled carrots down at the bottom in the vegetable tray. Measle didn't particularly like carrots, but he hadn't had one for such a long time that he'd forgotten what they tasted like. So he stuffed the paper bag into his pocket and then headed to the staircase. Measle raced up the creaking stairs, flight after flight, until he arrived, panting for breath, right at the top of the house. The attic door stood open. Measle went in and stared at the huge table. He carefully avoided looking up towards the rafters. It had been a month since he was last in here. Was there anything new, anything that he hadn't seen before? He looked all over the enormous table, and yes, there were some changes. Not with the set itself. The tracks and the trains were all in their usual places, and none of the buildings had been altered, but Basil had moved some of the model people around, and had put several of them into some very odd situations. There, for instance, near the coal yards, a workman in a blue coat and a yellow plastic helmet was sitting on the edge of a rectangular hole in the pavement. His hands were full of what appeared to be electrical cables. Obviously Basil wanted it to look as if the man was making repairs to the main power supply, but that wasn't all Basil wanted to show, for standing directly behind this workman, and unseen by him, was another figure of a man holding a bucket of water high in the air, and Measle saw that the bucket of water was about to be tipped over the workman. Measle knew that water and electricity was a very dangerous combination. Measle frowned. That was very odd. He looked over the train set again. What else was different? Ah, there, deep in the woods. The trio of bears were no longer strolling by the mirror lake. Now they were clustered around the base of a pine tree and all staring hungrily upwards. And there, high in the branches, was the figure of a little girl dressed as a brownie, clinging tightly to the tree trunk. Measle looked further, his eyes stopping on that scene that was taking place in a siding near one of the stations. A group of people were bending over something on the railway tracks. He looked closer, and the something was an old woman. And the people clustered around her were tying her down to the rails. This is weird, thought Measle. Why had Basil decided that some of the townspeople should be threatened like this? He started searching the train set again, There, in the town square, at the front of the town hall steps, a figure of a woman crouching in obvious terror, her fists pressed tightly over her eyes so as to block out the sight of the huge Bengal tiger that was creeping steadily towards her. Measle grinned. He couldn't help it. There was something quite funny about all of this. These poor people and all in such danger, but not really in any danger at all, of course, since everything was just plastic and nothing was real, other than Basil's strange imagination. Well, he'd certainly made the train set even more fascinating than ever. Was there anything else to see? Oh yes, there! A round, fat little man with a shiny bald head, carrying what looked like a heavy suitcase, running as fast as his short legs could carry him down a street that led out towards the forest. And behind him, in close pursuit, was a small mob of people carrying banners and placards on sticks. Measle leaned closer, peering at the tiny writing on the placards. "Down with knowledge" was written on one. "Death to a salesman" was written on another. Weirder and weirder, thought Measle. Anything else? He'd covered the town pretty closely. What about the forest? Anything other than the brownie and the bears? Oh yes! There in the clearing of cut down trees. A big black man was sitting on a tree stump, and at his feet lay a canvas stool bag, and next to it a tiny chainsaw and a red fuel can. The man's broad shoulders were slumped and his head hung low. There was a look of despair about him, and he seemed oblivious to the three figures creeping up behind him. The figures were modelled and painted to look like lumberjacks, and they were approaching him with great stealth, and all three were carrying axes raised over their heads. And look, there's the little fat man with the townsfolk chasing him. For a moment, Measle wondered whether it might be fun to rescue all these poor people from their predicaments. He could put the bears by the lake, he could throw the Bengal tiger out of the attic window, and he could untie the ropes that bound the old woman to the railway tracks. But no, that would be really stupid. Basil would get horribly angry if he messed about with the layout. What he was about to do was bad enough, but perhaps he might get away with it just this once. But if he changed anything that Basil had set up so carefully, then Basil would be sure to notice, and then he'd be in real trouble. Having made the decision, he squeezed through the narrow gap between the edge of the table and the wall until he came to the control box. The control box didn't look like the usual sort of electric train console. For a start, there weren't any plastic parts to it. The whole thing was made of black metal, and all the knobs were black metal too, and the knobs were larger than usual and had strange markings on them. But Measle had never seen an ordinary train controller, so he didn't think this one was odd at all. There was a tall stool where Basil Tramplebones sat. Measle climbed up onto it. If he leaned forward, he could just about reach all the knobs. He knew which ones started up the power and which ones controlled the different sections of track because he'd watched Basil carefully for a long time. So he reached out, turned the big black knob on the left of the control panel, and there was a low hum as the power came on. So far, so good. Now, which train to start with? The train Measle liked best was a little green freight train with a tall smokestack and two flatbed trucks that pulled behind it. The flatbed trucks were loaded with tiny logs, and this particular section of track took the freight train round the edge of the table to a miniature logging mill, where miniature circular saws cut the miniature logs into miniature planks of wood. Measle liked the little green freight train the best because it looked like the friendliest of all the trains. It didn't seem quite so menacing as most of the others did, particularly the biggest one of all, which was grimy, oily, monster locomotive, with a dented cowcatcher on the front and 3 dusty Pullman coaches behind it. So the little green freight train it would be. Measle put his hand on the third knob from the left and gently turned it. On the other side of the table, the little green freight train started to move slowly down its section of track. Measle turned the knob a little more, and the freight train picked up speed. It was moving away from him towards the far end of the table, and in a few seconds it would make the long turn at the end of the table and chug towards him. Measle intended stopping it at its usual station, the logging mill, a metre away from where he sat. He watched as it began to take the bend, and he turned the knob a little more, and the wheels of the freight train began to spin faster. Measle was concentrating so hard on what he was doing that he didn't see something which would have scared him badly. What he didn't see was this. And there you go. That's what's coming. The monster locomotive. The monster locomotive, with its dented cowcatcher and its 3 Pullman coaches, had begun to move out of its siding and onto the main track. It did so quite silently, and at first quite slowly, and since Measle had his back turned away from it, he didn't see or hear anything. The little freight train was now clattering towards him down the long straight section of track on the very edge of the table. Measle decided to let it keep its speed up and stop it by the logging mill at the very last minute, which was something he'd seen Basil do lots of times. He watched carefully as the freight train clicked and chuffed its way towards him, and the track here was quite long, and there was plenty of time to get ready for the stop. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Measle saw the monster locomotive. It had joined the main track, the same one the freight train was on, and was now racing towards the smaller engine, its pistons flying, its smokestack belching, and its oily wheels turning so fast that they seemed to blur. Measle gasped in horror. How could that have happened? He hadn't touched the knob that controlled this section of track. He'd never intended to, because he'd never liked the look of the monster locomotive and hadn't planned on using it at all. Quickly, which one was the locomotive controller? It was the 5th, wasn't it? Or was it the 4th? Measle reached for the 4th knob and turned it hard, but nothing happened. If anything, both the trains seemed to speed up. Measle twisted the 4th knob and the 2 trains seemed to lean forward towards each other as if they accelerated. He reached for both knobs and twisted them this way and that way, and when nothing happened, he twisted again and harder this time, and both knobs came away in his hands. Frantically, he tried to push them back in their spindles, but for some reason they wouldn't fit. So Measle grabbed the spindles themselves and tried to turn them, but his fingers slipped on the oily metal, and he couldn't get a proper grip. In desperation, he reached for the power-on knob and tried to twist it, but the knob refused to budge. Measle grasped it with both hands and strained with all his strength. It wouldn't move. And all the time he was trying to turn the knob or that, and the 2 trains were accelerating towards each other, and a head-on collision was inevitable, and Measle was powerless to stop it. And what's going on? The voice came from behind him, and Measle whipped round in the tool stall, almost falling off it in his fright. And there, in the doorway, stood Basil Tramplebone. His fish eyes were staring, and his long, bony fingers were clenched into fists. And for a moment, Measle thought he saw a trace of red on Basil's chalky cheeks. What have you been doing? Measle tried to say something. Anything. But his voice wouldn't work. His tongue felt swollen and his teeth felt numb. He didn't seem to be able to breathe. Behind him, he could hear the clatter as the 2 trains raced towards each other, but he couldn't turn and watch because Basil's fish eyes were staring at him, and Basil's bony fingers were curled into fists, and yes, 2 spots of angry red were standing on Basil's white cheeks. Suddenly, Basil's gaze switched from Measle's face to the train set. Measle saw Basil's eyes widen, and the 2 angry spots of red disappear, and then Basil's whole face went a strange shade of grey like a corpse. And then Basil did something very odd. He opened his mouth and said something. And to Measle, it sounded like a kind of snaky hiss mixed with a kind of throat clearing, mixed with a kind of teeth grinding, mixed with a kind of nose blowing sort of sound, which was a disgusting noise as Measle had ever heard. And at the same moment that Basil was making this blood curdling noise, a strange glint of green flame appeared in his eyes, and a second later 2 very bright green beams of light like twin lasers suddenly shot out from his pupils. The beams missed Measle by a centimetre, zipping past his face with a sizzling sound and making the air near his nose smell of burned rubber. And Measle cowered on the high stool and squeezed his eyes shut and put his hands over his ears because Basil had never done anything like this. Measle was suddenly very frightened indeed. With his eyes tightly closed and his ears covered, Measle didn't hear the crash of the two trains. He didn't hear or see anything for several seconds. And when he began to wonder why nothing was happening, even with his ears covered, it seemed to be awfully quiet. Surely Basil was going to hit him. And if so, why hadn't he done so already? What was going on? The seconds ticked by, and at last, Measle's curiosity got the better of him, and he cautiously opened his eyes. And then, he wished he hadn't. Basil was standing very close to him, smiling. Measle had never seen Basil smiling before. He hoped he never would again. Basil's smile was ghastly. Usually when people smile, the skin at the corner of their eyes wrinkles and at the same time, which makes them look friendly. Basil's eyes didn't wrinkle at all. They stayed exactly the same as always, big, round and fishy, and very, very cold. His thin, pale lips were stretched wide, revealing a row of long yellow teeth. The teeth at the sides of his mouth were even longer, and they came to a sharp point, and for a moment Measle thought Basil might be a vampire. But surely vampires only had one set of pointed teeth, one on each side. Basil had 3 pointed teeth on each side, which made him look like an alligator. So, we like playing with Basil's trains, do we? Measle swallowed hard. He'd never been so frightened in his life. I'm sorry, Mr. Tramplebone, sir, he managed to stammer. Sorry? I didn't mean for them to crash. Really, I didn't. Crash? There's been no crash, boy. Look for yourself. Measle did as he was told. He swivelled round on the tall stool and stared at the train set. It was true. There was no sign of a crash. In fact, the section of track where the two trains should have been, lying as Measle imagined they would be in a tangled pile of wreckage, was empty. Measle looked around the train set in wonder, and he saw that the monster locomotive was back in its siding, and the little green freight train was back at its starting point, right over there on the far side of the huge table. The humming sound of the electricity was gone, and all was quiet and peaceful and in its right and proper place. Mon Dieu, said Basil, his voice a whisper, very close to Measle's ear. Mon Dieu, there would have been a crash. A very nasty crash. And had I not arrived in the nick of time? And do you know how I arrived in the nick of time, Measle? No, sir. Then I shall tell you. I arrived in the nick of time because halfway to the bank I realised that today is Sunday. Sunday, Measle. And you know what Sunday means, don't you, Measle? No, sir. Sunday means that the banks are closed, Measle. Including our bank, Measle. So, it follows that we never had a call from the man at the bank this morning. Doesn't it, Measle? And there's Basil, looking very angry. Yes, sir. It follows that you made the story up. Doesn't it, Measle? Yes, sir. You lied to me, didn't you, Measle? You told me a falsehood. And you tampered with the telephone, didn't you, Measle? I'm really sorry, Mr. Tramplebone, sir. Basil panted Measle gently on his shoulder. Measle could feel the cold of Basil's fingers through the thin material of his shirt. "Of course you're sorry," whispered Basil. "And quite soon you're going to be even sorrier." A bone-chilling coldness flooded through Measle's body, and at the same time he could feel beads of sweat oozing out of his face. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "What are you going to do?"
"Ah, there's the question. What am I going to do? Well, Measle, I've always believed that the punishment should fit the crime."
"Don't you believe that, Measle?" "I suppose so, sir."
"You suppose so? Good. I suppose so too. Very well. Punishment for playing with my train set without my permission is that you will play in my train set with my full permission for the rest of your life."
What could he mean? "Play with your train set, sir?" stammered Measle.
"No, boy. You must try and listen when people talk to you. Not play with my train set. Play in my train set. Forever and ever and ever." "Now sit perfectly still and you won't get hurt."
And then Basil leaned very close to Measle, and he breathed softly into Measle's face. Measle tried hard not to, but he screwed up his face as though he'd just eaten a lemon. Basil's breath was foul, and it smelt of dead fish and old mattresses and the insides of ancient sneakers. Measle tried to lean away from the stench, but Basil kept on breathing on him, until it seemed impossible to Measle that such a thin chest could contain so much air. And when Measle felt sure that Basil couldn't possibly breathe out any more without taking a breath in, Basil simply went on producing this soft, disgusting smelling breeze and blowing it gently into Measle's face. Measle tried to hold his breath so he wouldn't have to smell it, but eventually he was forced to take a great gulp of air, and if anything, the smell was worse. And Basil seemed to be getting bigger. The more he breathed out, the bigger Basil seemed to grow, and now he was towering over Measle, his head the size of a bus. But that was impossible, surely. A bus would never fit in the attic. And for a moment, Measle dragged his eyes away from Basil's staring goldfish eyes and looked about him. Basil wasn't getting bigger. Measle was getting smaller. Already the stool on which he'd been sitting stretched out away on either side of him, as if it weren't a stool at all, but more like a broad table. And now his feet no longer dangled a few centimetres from the floor. Now the floor was a long, long way down, and Measle appeared to be sitting on the edge of a high cliff, looking down at a drop that, if he fell, would certainly kill him. Measle shuddered and scrambled back from the edge of the stool, and Basil went on breathing over him. Now the breeze was becoming a wind, and a hurricane, which forced Measle to fall back, so that now he was lying face upward on the flat wooden surface of the stool. He glanced to one side, trying to turn his face away from the dreadful smell, and he saw that the edge of the stool seemed to be so long, long way away. And then the hurricane stopped. Measle turned his head and stared up at Basil in horror. Basil was vast, tall as a mountain of black topped by the stark whiteness of his face, so that he looked to Measle like the snow-capped peak of Mount Everest.
"There now," said Basil, his voice a distant boom. "We've cut you down to size, haven't we, Measle? Oh yes, I should have done this years ago, but we had to keep up appearances, didn't we? Oh yes, but now, well, now we don't really need you anymore, do we? You see, 2 weeks ago, our bank appointed a new bank manager. Oh yes, and our new bank manager, Mr. Gredwald Gressel, is one of us. Well, one of me, I should say, and a very, very friendly fellow indeed, at least to me. We had a delicious conversation at the beginning of last week, Mr. Gressel and I, and well, the upshot of it all is that you were far too young to even have money. So all your lovely money is now in my control, Measle. It's mine. Mine. So you see, dear boy, you're now superfluous to my requirements."
Measle felt like crying, but he didn't. Measle had finished with crying. He'd done a lot of it when he was younger, and it hadn't changed a thing. So one day, he'd simply stopped crying and hadn't cried since. Instead, he lay quite still, waiting to see what Basil would do next. Basil said,
"Stay there, Measle. Don't move a muscle. Don't even blink, dear boy."
Measle thought that was an unnecessary thing to say. Where could he go? He was lying on a flat wooden plain surrounded on all sides by a long distant drop to the floor far beneath him. He watched as Basil moved away to the other side of the attic. A moment later he was back, looming huge over Measle in his enormous right hand, something the size of a house. He was holding something bright and silvery. The hand came slowly down towards Measle, and Measle saw that the bright silvery object was a pair of tweezers. The same tweezers that Basil used when he was performing some particularly delicate task, like putting on a new tree in place or rearranging the chips of coal in the coal yard. Now, to Measle, the tweezers looked gigantic. Each arm of the instrument was as long as an oar, and the points were coming steadily towards him.
"Lie quite still, Measle. This won't hurt if you lie quite still."
Measle did as he was told. He learned never to argue with Basil. Besides, Basil never lied about anything. It was the only good thing you could say about Basil. Of course, the truth from Basil was never a pleasant truth, but it was always the truth. Measle knew that if Basil said anything at all, it was always nasty and always true. If Basil said that poisonous blue frogs would fall from the black cloud that hung permanently over the gloomy house, you could be pretty sure before the day was out that the drains and the gutters would be full of very poisonous blue frogs. So, if Basil said it wouldn't hurt, then it wouldn't. And there's poor Measle getting picked up by the tweezers. It didn't hurt, but it was unpleasant all the same. Measle watched the ends of the tweezers touch the front of his shirt, and he felt the ends of the tweezers pinch together a wad of the material, then a pulling sensation as he was gently lifted up and up by his collar. Up and up he went until the top of the stool was far beneath him, and the attic floor even further. Measle kept very still. He knew that if he struggled, there was a good chance that his old shirt would split and that he'd drop away, and falling from this great height would certainly kill him. So he froze like a statue, his eyes wide open, praying that the collar of his shirt would hold. Basil swung his enormous arm, and Measle saw the great tabletop glide far beneath him. The forest, the little wooden cabins, the railway tracks, the sad grey train yards with the sad grey stations, and finally the mound of coal chips in its own little fenced-in yard. Measle felt himself going down. The ground seemed to rush towards him, and he closed his eyes, expecting to feel a sickening crunch as his body hit. But at the last moment, he felt a sudden slowing down in his descent, and he opened his eyes just wide enough to see that he was about to be deposited right in the middle of the coal heap. Basil placed him carefully on top of the coal heap, and then opened the tweezers, and the strain on Measle's shirt collar was released. "You always were such a dirty boy," said Basil, his voice rumbling like a distant thunderstorm. "And now you're even dirtier." "Why are you doing this?" shouted Measle. Oh, what was that? A little squeak from a dirty little mouse? You'll have to speak up, Measle. Your voice is so tiny now, I can't hear you at all. Measle struggled to his feet, glaring up at the black mountain that was Basil. "Listen, I'm sorry I played with the train set," he yelled as loudly as it could. "I'll never do it again." "Ah, that's better. I just about hear you now." Basil lowered his huge head until his white face seemed to fill the whole sky. "Not play with my train set ever again? But, Measle, my dear boy, you're welcome. Play in it as long as you like. Play in it forever. There's so much to do and so many things to see. Forests to explore, houses to live in, people to talk to. Of course, I'm afraid they won't talk back because they can't. They're all made of plastic. But at least they won't interrupt you when you tell them your life story, will they? I do so hate it when people interrupt, don't you?" "He's mad," thought Measle. And then, because the thought was so strong, Measle raised his head and shouted, "You're mad!" Basil smiled his terrible smile, revealing all 6 pointed teeth. "Well, of course I am, Measle. And how very sweet of you to say so. After that lovely compliment, I'm almost tempted to let you go. But no, I think not. If I did, I wouldn't be mad now, would I? And we can't have that now, can we? You see, being mad is such enormous fun. Enjoy yourself, young Measle. I'm going to leave you now, but I shall be back later to see how you're getting on." Basil turned away, and then he paused and turned back again. "Oh, one more thing, Measle. Don't worry about food and drink. You will not starve. If you look carefully, you'll find something to eat. Something very tasty. I promise. Bye-bye now." Basil moved swiftly away towards the attic door, and Measle felt a sudden wind as a great mass of air rushed to fill the space that Basil had left behind him. He heard the attic door open, then close. A deep silence filled the room, and Measle felt as alone as he'd ever felt in his life. He was about to climb down the steep, crumbly side of the coal heap when he heard the attic door open again, and Basil's hissing whisper, "Oh, Measle, just one more thing. A tiny word of warning. Stay under cover at night. It's not safe during the hours of darkness, the long hours of darkness. Not for a little mouse-like creature such as you. It's very dangerous for a little insect thing such as you. Hide at night, Measle. Hide well. Hide from the thing in the rafters, Measle." There was a low sound. For a moment, Measle couldn't imagine what it might be, and then he realised it was Basil laughing. The attic door closed again, and the silence returned. So that was it for chapter 2. Things are starting to get good now, eh? That's Measle being shrunk down and placed inside the train set. Join me for chapter 3, The Cure. That'll be out in the next couple of days. I hope you're enjoying it so far. Take care and good night.